Welcome everybody. I know it's a Friday, it's been a long week, and this is the sort of last mile, but you're all here for what I think is a very exciting event, this panel on civil society and human rights in Peril. My name is Patrick Heller. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology, and I'm here also at the Watson Institute, and I'm really honored to be able to present our panel today, but I want to tell you a little bit more about this event. For the last 4 years, Peter Evans, who's a senior fellow here at the Watson Institute, Cesar, Rodríguez-Garavito, who's going to be our first speaker, is executive director of Dejusticia and a sociologist as well. For the last 3 years, we've sort of worked together to run a series of events on what we call north to south dialogues, and the idea, it begins with the recognition that there are really important, innovative, important things happening in the global south, but unfortunately, because of global power hierarchies and dynamics, it's rare that those ideas from the south trickle up to the north. So we were hoping to use the Watson as a platform to instigate a number of dialogues. We've had dialogues on business and labor rights, we've had dialogues on transnational activism, and this year's theme, precipitated more by events than anything else, is this notion of civil society as peril. This is almost the 1-year anniversary of an event that none of us want to talk about. And you know, we're all in a sense of panic, and we have senators standing up and talking about the debasement of public debate in the United States of America, and it is dramatic and at times farcical. But in much of the global south and parts of Eastern Europe, it's arguably even more serious, that there have been systematic attacks on the autonomy of civil society organizations. And the larger effect, and we started this morning with a number of conversations, and there's a consensus. There are 15 human rights activists amongst us today, as well as a number of academics who work on this subject. And I think across the board, the consensus is that there's a wave happening. There's a trend globally of state-sanctioned attacks against civil society. They take many, many forms. And so what we'd like to do in this panel is document some of those mechanisms, try to identify some patterns, and also think collectively about the creative ways in which civil society organizations have responded. So we've assembled what I think is truly a sort of dream team of global civil society activists, beginning with Cesar, who is largely responsible for bringing this network together. And as I said, Cesar is a well-known sociologist of law and the executive director of Dejusticia. And for those of you who don't know, this is an incredibly powerful NGO working out of Bogota that does a lot of work in Colombia, but is also, with support from the Ford Foundation, been doing a lot of global networking and kind of transnational activism. We have Mandeep Tiwana from CIVICUS, which has been monitoring and actively documenting a lot of the trends that we'll be talking about today. We have Biraj, Patnaik, who's the regional director of Amnesty International for South Asia. We have Stefania Kapronczay, apologize for my pronunciation, who's the executive director of the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union. And we have Bilge Yesil, who's an associate professor at City University of New York. Cesar is going to begin with some introductory remarks, and then each panelist will speak for 10 minutes, and everyone's going to be super disciplined and stick to their 10 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And before I forget, and I don't see her, where's Ellen White? None of us would be here, none of us would have been fed, no plane tickets would have been bought. We wouldn't be having these conversations if it wasn't for the extraordinary work of Ellen White and for the entire Watson team. So I know they're streaming this live, and hopefully they're watching, so hopefully you'll all join me in thanking them for that.
It's activated by clapping. Okay, thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Peter, Ellen, and the Watson community. It's a true pleasure for me to come back. I was a visiting professor here at the Center for Latin American Studies about 3-4 years ago. And that's actually when we concocted this, conspired to create this partnership that's proved to be particularly fruitful and congenial. Just a couple of weeks ago, we launched the first book. Cambridge University Press published a book that we did out of the 2014 workshop on business and human rights. Then we did another one a couple of years ago on transnational advocacy networks. And this is the third such event. And as Patrick said, in addition to being an effort to invert the South-North logic and geopolitics of knowledge, it is also an effort to bring together activists and scholars to brainstorm and hopefully develop responses to challenges that are relevant to the practice of social justice and human rights. Now, since we have an audience of students, I wanted to make sure that we don't give the impression that this is a grim world, that there's a crisis in the human rights movement. We still want to recruit students like Sean and Camila for Dejusticia. So take this with a big grain of salt. With OSF last year, we ran a number of regional workshops out of the Human Rights Lab and Dejusticia on whether or not there was a crisis in human rights activism. And one of our colleagues in the event, regional event in Europe, came up with this framing of transformation as opposed to crisis that I like, because there is a number of challenges. I've written some pieces on the challenges and transformations in human rights practice, among which are the responses to the crackdown on civil society around the world. But as I see it, and as Chris, my colleague with whom I've done all this work, and I tend to see it, the glass half full. Well, human rights and social justice activists could not have expected to get away with the same strategies, with the same discourse forever. It's been 30 years, it's been a relatively successful story of the expansion of human rights norms. One treaty after another was adopted in one country after another. The human rights discourse became the lingua franca of progressive politics in many parts of the world. So by any comparative standard, it's been a story of considerable progress. But of course, the targets, both governments, corporations, and other types of targets of human rights activism and social justice advocacy, they also learn, and they react, and they wise up to those strategies. And in a way, what's been going on over the last 10, 15 years is a process, it's a learning process on the part of the targets of human rights activism. So by the 20th year that an organization funded by a US foundation gives you a hard time, well, you start thinking, well, what if I tinker with the flow of funds coming from the US into Kenya, right? And when you lose yet another battle before the courts as a national government because you're accused of being anti-minority, right? Minorities. Well, maybe the skillful government lawyer will come up with a way to use the discourse of minority rights to go after what they see as an elite that's been using this human rights framework to go after a minority that you want to protect as a state official. So this is what we call, and I'm going to explain this. I'm just going to show you this little graph so that there's some recollection of what's been happening over the last 15 years. Many human rights scholars used to talk about the forward-moving spiral of the expansion of human rights declarations, conventions, and norms in general. So the idea was that there was this norms cascade, as Cass Sunstein called it in one of his books, in which there was an outward an evolution from state denial of human rights violations to all the way to slowly but surely to normative recognition of the value of human rights and eventually behavioral changes, which actually states not only recognized the normative value of human rights, but also actually complied with those norms. what we may be seeing, and Chris and I and Dejusticia started this project, when in one country after another we would go and work with a counterpart, say in India. This is a true story. And we would we would partner on a project on socioeconomic rights. And our partners would informally tell us about how the Indian government was cracking down on their organizations. Then it was Turkey, same story. Just next door, we're based in Colombia, Venezuela. And I'll have a little graph here put together by a fantastic human rights organization, very well-known human rights organization in Venezuela that's been introducing really exciting innovations in human rights activism. So this is in Spanish, but you know that President Maduro used to be a bus driver, right? So this is the backsliding of Venezuelan democracy. So they said, look at all the stops that Maduro has been going through in dismantling the democratic apparatus, the democratic institutional framework. So you first, he gets elected, then he co-opts the justice system, then he uses state of exception or state of siege powers to go after those who, according to him, threaten public stability and public order. Then he goes all the way to co-opt and control the Electoral Commission, and finally he suspends elections. Right? So those are all the types of measures that we're concerned with, that we can see in one country after another in a worryingly large sample. And beyond what happens to human rights organizations, the question is, well, at what point does this regime turn into an autocracy, right? So this is not just, although this conference and this panel is framed in terms of attacks against civil society, what one sees in many of these places is the erosion and sometimes the destruction of democracy itself. So that's why when we see what's happening with a lot of apprehension in the U.S. One description of the Trump presidency that resonates with me is someone said that this was the Latin Americanization of the U.S. And hopefully it won't last very long, but when you see one measure after another, it sounds familiar, it looks familiar, right? You could paint a similar picture, luckily not so dire, at least yet, but the question is that beyond tinkering with the protection of civil society spaces, what many of the authoritarian or semi-authoritarian governments in different parts of the world what they are chipping away at is the basic infrastructure of democratic governance. And I'm going to end and turn it over to my colleague Chris by simply giving you a sense of the processes that we're trying to analyze in our own seminar and in the publication that's going to come out of this workshop. For those of you who are interested in, like sociologists are always interested in processes of transnational dissemination. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of affinity and actually textual similarities among the different laws that are being implemented in, and that embody this crackdown on civil society spaces. This is the process of dissemination. Quickly, I don't have time to discuss any of the details of what's called the Foreign Agents Law, meaning a law that this is Russia, the center of this network here is Russia, one of the pioneer countries that put in place basically a legal framework whereby any NGO would be considered a foreign agent for state security purposes just by the fact that they received foreign funding. And similar laws can be seen in all of these countries. So Hungary, we have Steffi here. And the question is, and we can go on and on. This is all the countries that we could fit in one single slide, but very recently Venezuela, and a few years ago Ecuador. The process that we're interested in now is in creating kind of a reverse dissemination process. What if we do an inventory of responses by civil society organizations, by scholars, by many actors interested in maintaining and renewing the strength of the democratic governance and the guarantee of human rights. So what we're doing here is trying to write short case studies of promising responses, and hopefully over time contribute to the dissemination of good ideas and good responses, like the ones that CIVICUS, Mandeep, the network that Mandeep works for, has also promoted over the last few years. I'll skip this and turn it over to wrap up to Chris.
So Cesar has talked about this crackdown on civil society, but what exactly do we mean by that? There's this wave that was mentioned. We identify the different types or manifestations of the crackdown into two types. One would be an attack against the legitimacy of civil society, and the other one would be an attack against the efficacy of civil society. Let's start with legitimacy. And I'll focus on a particular sector of civil society, knowing, of course, that civil society consists of a diverse array of actors, from individuals, e-activists, labor unions, etc. But in our research, we decided to focus on human rights NGOs. What is the source of legitimacy of human rights NGOs that sets them apart or puts them above other actors in society? Number one, they're considered as principled entities. By principled, we mean that first, they are non-profit, they're not motivated by profit, and that sets them apart from businesses. The second one is that they share an affinity of aspirations with citizens. And the third one, supposedly, is that they uphold high moral standards. And how do you attack the legitimacy of human rights NGOs knowing these characteristics? First, non-profit, like what Cesar said, the foreign agents law in different countries. Basically, human rights NGOs in many places are being attacked as hired guns or mercenaries. I am quoting here actual statements used by governments to smear the reputation of human rights NGOs. And in terms of their connection with citizens, they try to break that link by saying, you know, they don't really care about the things you care about. They're too elitist, they're technocratic, they speak in dry scientific language, they're all based out of the capitals of their countries. And in fact, they don't care about development. In the case of India, that's one strong narrative that the government is using against environmental NGOs that oppose extractive projects. They're saying they're anti-development, and according to, well, the Indian Intelligence Service, without proof, they claim that NGOs actually lessen the GDP of India by 2 to 3% per year. So that kind of narrative, that kind of smear campaign is a form of crackdown against civil society. The second one, non-political, or non-politicized. By that, I don't mean that human rights NGOs cannot make political stances. What I mean is that unlike political parties that formally contest governmental power, human rights NGOs supposedly don't. And the third one is human rights NGOs supposedly non-violent, and that sets them apart from security forces or insurgent movements which achieve their goals through the use of violence. And the attacks against the legitimacy of civil society organizations is precisely to show the opposite, that human rights NGOs operate like businesses, they are hired guns, they are violent, or that they are immoral, however you define it, based on the context of the society. Like in Russia, it would be a powerful narrative to claim that someone is homosexual, because that is there's strong bias against homosexuality in Russia. And then the second type, so these are the specific manifestations of attacks against legitimacy. I was speaking about smear campaigns, and also attacks against the media, which also includes using the media as a form of propagating the smear campaigns. And the second one is efficacy. This refers to the material capabilities of human rights NGOs to do their work. So what the government would do would be to restrict the funding sources of human rights NGOs, to impose a lot of administrative restraints on them, not allowing them to register or allowing them to register, but requiring them to go through so many administrative hoops that it becomes impossible to run as an NGO. And finally, attacks against their fundamental freedoms, prevention of protests, arbitrary detentions, and the like. So these are the different and additional types of attacks. Cooptation, this means that if you can't, in addition to directly restricting civil society, you create an alternate civil society, government-owned NGOs, or you just hire members of legitimate civil society into governments to co-opt or silence them, and also attacks against individuals, which I will end with. A very disturbing phenomenon that we've seen, it has existed even before, but even more so now, I think, is the direct attack or the subjection to personal liability of members or directors of NGOs. And Stefania here has personal experience of that. She has to appear in court very soon for a charge of defamation, a personal charge of defamation, for signing a petition as director of her organization. That was a petitioner statement by the organization. So, but take it with a grain of salt. It's fun to be a human rights.
Stefania, do you mind going next? Yeah, because that's a perfect segue.
Yeah, thank you. So I will start with reading a quote. It is very important that we make it clear that we are not opposing non-governmental organizations here. It is not non-governmental organizations who are moving against us, but paid political activists who are attempting to enforce foreign interest here in Hungary. And I will discuss about how we at the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union responded to this. But before that, I would give you just a little bit of overview of what is happening in Hungary, because oftentimes I get the question like, oh, really, Hungary, it's a part of EU, so what's going on there? So what we saw in Hungary, since 2010, that it has become an illiberal state from a progressing European democracy. There were two terms of the current government. The first can be characterized as reshaping the constitutional system, and the second one is shrinking the democratic space, including weakening the media pluralism, but also clamping down on dissenting voices. And among the dissenting voices, we can count the NGOs. And the one way of attacking NGOs and civil society organizations in general is the foreign funded organizations bill that Cesar mentioned. And the other one is the very concentrated smear campaign that is ongoing against civil society organizations. And for that, you have to understand that the majority of the media outlets now are in the hands of the government, either state-owned or owned by businessmen having close ties to the government. That's one part that you have to bear in mind when I'm telling you this story. And the other one is the type of language that it's using. It's a highly stigmatizing language that connects true facts in a way that suggests that there's some sort of conspiracy, and stigmatizing in a way that not only saying that it's foreign-funded organizations, but it's also serving foreign interest, which in the government's rhetoric means that it's not serving Hungary's interest. It's unpatriotic what these organizations are doing. And my organization, along with other organizations, are regularly named in those articles. So this is what we are up against, and why I think the smear campaigns that attack our legitimacy is very important, because it speaks to the question of credibility and the reputation of NGOs, of civil society organizations, which are one of the, in my opinion, the biggest asset of these organizations, because this comes from my beliefs that human rights organizations and civil society organizations truly benefit the people. They are truly beneficial for the people. But if that belief is questioned and put into question by the government, then we have a problem, because we won't be able to carry out our job, that is protecting the rights of the people in our case. So I think legitimacy and counter narratives are really key when tackling the current shrinking space of civil society phenomenon. And it's also a very interesting interesting work to engage with, because we human rights lawyers are very much used to the rationalized, abstract, rights-based language that we learned in law school and in universities. And actually, during coming up with a counter-narrative, we realized that rationality is not the only driver for human behavior, but there's also emotions and values that are much, much stronger in explaining why people follow certain ideas. So, and that's one part of it. And the other, why it was really fun, because we realized that usually human rights organizations are seen as protecting the most vulnerable, the most persecuted, that the majority of the society usually sees that they are somebody but not us. And while we were looking at our work, we really realized that what we are up against is, what we are working against is the system, is the establishment that is actually failing a lot of people, not only a small fraction of the society. So when we realize this, that there are these values and emotions that are really important in our work, and we are doing this work not because of the money, but because of these values, and that we don't have to be defensive about our work, because actually we are protecting a lot of people in the country. That's when we came up with the HCLU is Needed campaign, and a couple of ideas about it. And I don't know how much time I have left. 4 minutes. Oh, great. So I will slow down. So first, that I would like to highlight that we decided that we won't respond directly to the stigmatization. That was really key, because when you respond directly, you are in a defensive position. You don't have the media outlets to respond to, and you kind of come across as explaining yourself. And what we decided to do, that instead we will create an alternative narrative, and we will use the limited landscape, media landscape and social media that is still quite free in the country, to just create a compelling narrative. And that became the HCLU is Needed campaign, which has, I have a couple of comments about the content of it, which are that we wanted to show who we are, what we believe in, and who do we really work for, which is not, foreign money and George Soros, but the clients that we are working for. That was one part of it. And the other one, I think format was really important as well. Human rights organizations tend to produce really lengthy reports, in a jargon that not many people outside of these conference rooms understands or care about. So we decided that, okay, so it's a social media campaign, so let's look at the formats that are really spreading across social media. And we came up with the idea that, so we should create memes, but how do you create memes? And we decided that we will put our values on its pictures on media that look like inspirational quotes, that I'm sure you are all familiar with this, that gets shared a lot. So we put faces to the human rights organization. These are the clients who we are working for. These are the people who work here. And we work here because we believe in this stuff. And we also show that, okay, these are our values. And what was also important about showing these values, that they are coming from this realization that we are not only working for a small minority, but a bigger constituency. So we showed that that work that we were already doing, for example, tackling hospital infections. So in human rights jargon, the right to safe healthcare. But what it meant really for the society or for the majority of the people, that I don't want to get infected when I'm getting treated in a hospital. So this is what we put on. So the format and the content as well. So we were really experimenting with the language. How do we tell the compelling narrative about human rights that doesn't change what human rights are, but actually telling it in a way that people can resonate with, and that tells the real story of human rights that is for the people and for those people who are failed by the system. And I will leave it.
Mandeep?
Can I go last, maybe because I think because you'll be sharing some regional examples and I'll speak
I
on
could
global.
go next. Sure. Thank you, friends. It's a great privilege to be here. Thanks to Patrick and to Cesar for inviting me over. I just wanted to bring attention to what's happening in India. As Krishna said in her introductory remarks, that there was an Intelligence Bureau report which alleged that 2 to 3% of the GDP is being reduced in India because of the activities of non-governmental organization. And then it went on to list the Intelligence Bureau report, which was leaked to the media in 2014, just barely weeks after the new government had come to power, which listed a few organizations, including Greenpeace. What followed was a massive crackdown on foreign-funded organizations. And in 2014, in just that 1 year, 23,000 plus organizations had lost their ability to receive foreign funding in India. So they were essentially deregistered from receiving foreign funding in India, which represented roughly half of the number of organizations who had the ability to receive foreign money. A lot of these organizations were deregistered on technical grounds, but 25 organizations out of these were specifically targeted for acting against public interest, and it was no surprise that a vast majority of those 25 organizations had links to either their work in Gujarat in 2002, immediately after the riots that followed when Mr. Modi was the chief minister, or to very prominent campaigns against private sector organizations. So there we are in terms of what's happening on the deregistration on this foreign agent law. Now, this is not to say that this law is new to India. This was an emergency era legislation which was introduced in 1976 called the Foreign Currency Regulation Act, essentially at a time when India suspended all civil liberties for 2 years. And in an atmosphere where it was felt that the next Chile is going to be New Delhi, that the CIA was on the verge of overthrowing the government, we needed a new law. And the law was, in its original form, was less about civil society and more about public servants receiving foreign funding. The narrative changed in 2010 when the Congress government, the UPA, was in power, when suddenly this law was turned into something that addressed far less the political parties that it was meant to check and much more on civil society. And ironically, the only two major defaulters on foreign funding for public activities are the two main political parties in the country, which is the Congress Party, and the Indian National Congress, and the BJP. And when they were caught out, within a day, legislation was passed in Parliament with retrospective effect, which changed the rules retrospectively, allowing the Congress Party and the BJP Party to have received these funding, because essentially they received it from companies who were registered abroad, and therefore they were ineligible to fund political parties in India. But a slight tweak in the law overnight allowed them to receive this funding, and the matter is now pending in the Supreme Court. Now, this is just one example of how this has happened. You also saw travel bans on individuals, most notably on Priya Pillai of Greenpeace. You had deregistration of organizations, which of course, thankfully, the courts have stayed. But every month, literally, if not every week, sees a new assault on the ability of civil society to mobilize, on the right to association, and so on. I mean, if you take just this month of October, the month started with the National Green Tribunal which is a tribunal, environmental tribunal, banning the presence of NGOs to protest at the only venue in Delhi which they were allowed to protest, which is Jantar Mantar, which is about 4 kilometers away from Parliament and so on. And this venue was reserved for protests. So the only venue was removed, and now it's being moved many, many kilometers away, where you will have no access to government, no access to politicians, no access to institutions of government in Ramlila Maidan, which is difficult to reach. What is notable is that even this space of protest was designated after 1988, when millions of farmers turned up in Delhi at the Boat Club, close to 500,000 farmers, and government officials had great difficulty getting to work. So they decided that this part of Delhi can't be designated as a protest zone, and it was shifted to Jantar Mantar. And now even that venue has been taken away. Later that week, we saw the Niti Aayog, which is the new variant of the Planning Commission of India, pass orders which said that every NGO has to compulsorily register with them and get a unique identity number, which in itself seems quite harmless, because this was something that organizations which were getting government funding had to do earlier. But now the Niti Aayog says that if you get foreign funding, you have to get this number. So why should one be alarmed with being registered with government? It's because you are already registered with the Ministry of Home Affairs, you're registered with the tax authorities, you're registered with the GST authority, you're registered with the Registrar of Societies or the trust, as the case may be, and you're registered with the Interior Ministry, which is the Ministry of Home Affairs, under a very regressive law, which is the FCRA, and you have one more layer of registration. Why a number? Because it allows the state to, the deep state, to track individuals associated with NGOs in a way that was not possible 3 years ago. So every NGO has to, every office bearer has to give the unique identity number, 3 years of their tax returns, and so on and so forth, already under existing legislation, and state which other NGOs they are associated with. Which means that just by a flick of a switch on a computer program, you can actually make a network of any individual who's associated with an NGO with other organizations and draw your own conclusions. So that's, we also had, in the name of transparency, an attempt to force office bearers of NGOs to declare their assets and those of their spouses and dependents and put it in the public domain under a law which was essentially meant for public servants, which is the Lokpal Act. And of course, because a number of NGOs were also philanthropic trusts of major corporations in India, and they wouldn't want their assets to be made known, they made common cause with civil society organizations, and now that measure stands suspended. So, friends, I'd like to say that this extraordinary attack on civil liberties, the extreme form of which is the tragic and sad lynching of individuals from the Muslim community on alleged consumption or possession of beef, which Harsh spoke about when he spoke about yesterday, when he spoke about the caravan of love that he carried out, or the killing of journalists, the most recent one being that of Gauri Lankesh in Bangalore. It is not that the space for civil society was very large under earlier regimes. And as I pointed out, a number of these laws which are now being used to oppress civil society were actually passed by governments before this government came to power. What we have now, therefore, is what's changed is a heightened sense of impunity that did not exist earlier. The ability, whether it's of television anchors or trolls on the internet, Twitterati, to attack individuals or organizations without any legal basis, make a slew of allegations and get away with it. The active involvement of tax and regulatory authorities in going after organizations and individuals who are dissenting, and also the mainstreaming of the discourse on the attack on minorities, mainstreaming it in a way which was inconceivable, to slander, say, a national monument like a Taj Mahal as something, as being an edifice constructed by invading Muslims and therefore something that the state didn't need to protect, or a legitimizing of the attacks on people allegedly possessing or consuming beef. So I think that mainstreaming, which we see now, is quite frightening, and that is something that frames the context in which civil society is under attack in India. Thank you.
Hi, thank you to the organizers, and thanks everyone for being here today. My area of expertise is in media studies, more specifically Turkish media, culture, and politics, and also media in the Middle East. But this year, a lot of new terms that have entered our lexicon, our everyday language, has brought a lot of memories. So one is fake news, the other one is post-truth. And every time my American or US-based colleagues who study journalism and American media and politics and political communication have expressed their shock at, the ubiquity of fake news or the presence of a so-called ill-informed public, or a presidential candidate and then the president, lying and simply getting away with it. Every time they have expressed their shock, I used to say, "You're new at this." So how does all of this resonate? And I'm not necessarily going to make a comparison between United States and Turkey, especially in terms of their media systems, and definitely not a comparison between Trump and Erdogan, president of Turkey since 2002. But I want to nonetheless map some connections, and perhaps this will give us some, food for thought in terms of, the relationship between civil society, the media landscape, and electoral politics. So over the past year or so, there has been increasing interest, especially among the scholarly community, and the rise of populism. So this is not a phenomena unique to the United States, but also we see this in Western Europe, with Brexit and the rise of far-right parties in Austria and even in Germany. So tied to this, the rise of especially right-wing nationalist, populist discourse and rationalities, excuse me, there's also the appeal of the strongman. So Trump and Erdogan and other, global leaders definitely, carry that appeal, while at the same time they identify themselves as, man of the people, or they align themselves with, the ordinary folks, and perpetuate this kind of, anti-elite discourse. So the anti-elite can be, the universities, academics, or even NGOs, international NGOs, and also media institutions. So another thing that has resonated for me is how, for example, both Trump and Erdogan, and maybe we can give examples from Latin America, because you talked about Latin Americanization. Me and my Turkish origin colleagues here in the United States were like, United States is becoming like Turkey now. But so we can, multiply these examples. So this appeal of the strong man and the anti-elite currents, and especially, the framing of media organizations as elite institutions. So when Trump calls out on, New York Times and CNN and Washington Post, and they say, oh, they're spreading fake news. This is what a lot of the, the populist nationalist leaders do as well. And I think this has crystallized when Trump called media, certain media institutions, the enemy of the people. All right, so there is that very clear labeling of certain critical media outlets as anti-people or against the nation or against national unity, propagating fake news. So this brings us to the politicization and polarization, not only in the political field, but also in the media field. And I want to tell you a little bit about the arc of Turkish media landscape. So maybe, you know, like we can continue this conversation about similarities and differences between Turkey, U.S., you know, like Latin America, China, Russia, and whatnot. And this, I think, one of the first things we need to think about is the commercial and the corporate nature of media. So a lot of times, academics, media analysts, or pundits, and even ordinary folks at cocktail parties tend to think that, you know, media is, you know, like free, and we have a democratic and liberal press system in the West. But, you know, like all those, you know, like unfortunate journalists in the third world or in the Middle East or in Latin America are, you know, like suffering in this, you know, like suppressive media regime. So even that, you know, like the Western liberal press ideals and how they come to be, you know, like interrogated and challenged and opposed, I think that what's been happening in the, you know, like since the Trump presidency and what's been happening in the media field has kind of, you know, like blown up all those, you know, ideals and has led us to question them. So when we start, you know, like looking at these, you know, like liberal Western ideals, oftentimes we do not think about the commercialized and the corporatized nature and how media owners, media companies, or their parent conglomerates can be in this, you know, like kind of political, economic relationships with the government or the state. So in the case of Turkey, this has become a very pronounced problem, starting with the 1980s and the 1990s, when Turkey began to enter into the global economic system and restructured its economy, which brought with it the rapid commercialization of the media landscape. So a lot of, you know, like businessmen and entrepreneurs who wanted to have these, you know, like close relationships with the government, to curry favors with them and to extract, you know, like bids, privatization deals from the government, started entering the media business. And of course, in the United States, it's a completely different story. I mean, like Fox News, it is owned by, you know, like Murdoch and News Corp, but they're not necessarily in, you know, like energy or finance or construction. But nonetheless, they, you know, like they very much seek to maintain friendly relations, or, you know, like maintain those illogical or political affiliations with the with either the Democrats or the Republicans, because when they, you know, like seek out new ventures or merge with another media entity, or buy another, you know, like newspaper or giant television outlet, these all have to be, you know, like approved by the FCC or the courts and whatnot. So there is your, you know, like political alliance right there. And, you know, like Trump, according to, you know, like some anecdotal evidence, Trump used that as a threat to CNN because CNN's parent company was trying to merge with or acquire a major telecom company, and Jared Kushner, you know, like had a meeting with the head of Time Warner, and, you know, like made some remarks about how this could, you know, like be derailed. So in the United States, it manifests itself in different ways, but this political economic collusion is obviously a problem, and it is a global problem. How many, did you say?
Minutes.
Oh, okay, I knew, yeah, all right. So another constraint on media freedoms in Turkey has to do with the legal framework. And this does not necessarily apply to the US context because, you know, like obviously the First Amendment, and in the US we do not have, you know, like general or, you know, like federal laws that apply to all press outlets or journalists. But in the case of Turkey, from the constitution to the penal code to the anti-terror law, there are several provisions that can restrict the work of journalists and their freedom of speech and expression. But there are also specific media laws, such as the press law, the internet law, and broadcasting law. So on one hand, you have this, you know, like seemingly commercial media system, which are owned by, you know, like individual entrepreneurs or private companies, but they are very much state dependent because of their economic needs, economic imperatives, but they're also under a lot of pressure because of the application, the selective application of the legal provisions, which can always, and it does, lead to several numbers of, huge numbers of journalists being imprisoned, jailed, or leading to self-censorship of journalists and reporters for fear of illegal crackdown. So at this point, one final thing about social media and the online public sphere. Since the Arab Spring, there's been a lot of celebratory thinking around social media. It's been called the Twitter revolution, Facebook revolution, which always makes me go like, oh. But still, in places like Turkey and other countries, when the press is under so much economic pressure because of financial sticks, right? And when the government has cultivated its own partisan media by providing them, financial carrots, and when a lot of journalists either are, self-censoring themselves or are in prison, so they've been, very effectively silenced. So the last refuge seems to be, the online public sphere. And again, it's kind of like this cyclical thing. So the activists, dissidents, and human rights activists, civil society actors, kind of migrate to that new arena, and then the government, tries to impose stricter rules. But then, then that, imposition of stricter internet laws in Turkey at least has, generated new kinds of creative responses. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. I have to stop there, but I'm sure we'll have time to talk about those later. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Dejusticia and Brown University for hosting me here. I'm going to speak from the perspective of CIVICUS, which is a global civil society alliance. So I'm going to try and tie in some of the things that you've been speaking. But I wanted to throw something out there for the audience is, we live in a very interesting moment, or actually a sad moment in world history. I mean, if you look at the history of human rights in the late half of the 20th century, we made progress. Whether it was the decolonization movements, whether it was the civil rights movements, whether it was the struggle to accept refugee rights, migrant workers' rights, the International Convention on Migrant Workers was signed in the second half of the 20th century, whether it was the women's rights movement, whether it was the struggle for climate justice, environmental rights. We made a lot of progress in the 20th century. But in the first 17 years of the 21st century, we've actually started to go back, which is a matter of deep concern for us. Rather than going forward, we find that there's been a steady erosion of human rights. And this is a big challenge particularly for those of us who work on human rights and social justice norms, whose work involves speaking truth to power, holding the spotlight to very powerful people, and we find that there's a greater number of attacks that are happening. In democracies and in authoritarian countries, we find that there's new kinds of laws that are being introduced, which make it very difficult to form associations, which make it, which provide government control and greater intrusion over the work of civil society organizations. We find in some countries powerful political figures tend to stigmatize civil society activists, which I think some of you have already spoken about. In some countries, activists have been attacked. They have been implicated in false cases. And they continue to be, to face a lot of obstacles in their work. The issue of civil society earlier used to be thought, is a problem of the developing world. It's a problem of non-developed, but this is a global problem today. It's a problem of the global South as well as the global North. And it's an all-pervasive problem if you look at it. And it's creating some particular challenges for us in advancing the human rights discourse. So with this premise, I just wanted to, dig down deeper a little bit into what are some of the root causes of this decline in civic space or the notion of closing civil society space that we are speaking about. In fact, the degradation started to happen immediately after 9/11, when Western democracies started to lower their standards on human rights. They started to lower fair trial standards, and then there was a slippery slope that started to happen. A number of authoritarian governments saw this as an opportunity for them to start attacking those who challenge them, who challenge their power, who try to impose accountability on them. And it's continued further. And then in 2011, we had a very important, moment, and many of us were really excited when we found the revolution happening in Tunisia, and then in Egypt, there was a people's mobilizations. And these mobilizations happened in Syria, there was people's protests. In Zimbabwe, there were protests. In Uganda, there were protests. In fact, when people talk about the so-called Arab Spring, people oftentimes forget that there were lots of mobilizations in sub-Saharan Africa, in countries like Angola and elsewhere, too. And what happened was that because of these mobilizations, what happened in Libya and in Syria and, of course, in Egypt and Tunisia, the authoritarian leaders became extremely fearful of the power of civil society to upend the existing political discourse. So they started to really hit back with harsher tactics, and which has been which is of course playing out now today. But we also find that another challenge to advancing the civil society and human rights discourses, we live in a time of searing inequality. In fact, many people have spoke about we are now facing 19th century levels of inequality, and I know it's not very popular sometimes to say that, but I think this is because of economic policies that that have been pushed, the politics of economic fundamentalism, where we find that in almost every country of the world, you have businessmen with extensive political interests, and you have politicians who are, politicians who are, of course, business people in politics who have extensive business interests, and people from business coming into politics to protect their business interests. So you don't know where the state ends and business starts, and there's increasing collusion between political and economic elites. So if you're a land rights activist, if you're an environmental activist, if you're opposing a big agricultural project or a big mega industry, or you're shining a spotlight on corruption that involves relatives of politicians, you are likely to be attacked, and it's creating big challenges. There's also another challenge that we faced in the 21st century, which is that there's increasing ghettoization of the world. We have rising extremism of both religious type and extremism of an ideological type. So civil society organizations, those who believe in the values of peace and tolerance and justice, for them, civil society organizations are an existential threat. So these people who believe in the politics of hate or in the ideology of divisiveness, for them, they tend to attack civil society organizations or equality for that matter. So if you're an LGBTI activist, a number of extremist groups would attack you. If you're a women's rights activist in some parts of the country, you get attacked. Or if you speak out on the rights of refugees and migrant populations, you get vilified and stigmatized and attacked and worse. So, and then on top of that, we are facing a monumental crisis of democracy. In fact, I'm going to say, in many countries of the world, we have, and in all continents, in fact, we have megalomaniacs and sociopaths who have managed to come to power using the electoral system. These are people we won't even trust to babysit our children for an hour, and they get to run countries. And that's the big challenge. And these people, they really believe in electoral power. So they actually do believe in the process of elections, and they go through it. But once they get elections, for them, then that means their mandate is absolute. So then they start to talk in terms of their mandate. They divide societies. And then if civil society organizations that speak about the rights of excluded populations, then they start to attack these organizations. They start to delegitimize them, or those that demand, accountability from these powerful figures. There's obviously many challenges, and coupled with this, we find there's a retreat from progressive internationalism. If you've been watching the UN debates that happened last month, you would find there's greater talk about sovereignty, about national values, cultural values, which is an anathema to those of us who believe in the universality of the human rights discourse, who believe that the human rights system, and if you look at it in the post-Second World War, was to create a universal human rights system that would permeate all cultures, because the right to be treated fairly, the right to be treated without discrimination, the right to be able to be what you can be, to live to your full potential, is a fundamental human aspiration. Yet many of these, whether they are autocratic monarchs, or whether they are right-wing populists, or whether they are military-backed regimes, they tend to want to degrade that. So the degradation of democracy is, in fact, at the moment presenting a great challenge. And in fact, many governments that used to speak the language of human rights and democracy in the external discourse have now started to do a retreat. So we are facing a time of falling standards. In fact, we've done some research at CIVICUS. We have a participatory research methodology where the three freedoms on which civil society rests, the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, are really being challenged. And in fact, our research finds that only 2% of the world's population now live in countries where these freedoms are adequately protected. So what do we do in this situation? Those of us who believe in human rights and social justice, what do we do? So one thing certainly we need to do is we need to understand the problem. We need to engage. We need to engage with the fact that there are people who are voting for these populist leaders, and I think you did speak about that, Stefania, a little bit. So we need to understand. We need to engage directly with them, but without compromising our values. We need to engage. We need to have a reasoned debate with them, but without appeasing the politics of xenophobia or sexism or ultranationalism. We also need to get people to understand. These people, a lot of the right-wing populists believe in propaganda. They are extremely clever at using the social media. They are, they speak in very simple language that appeals to, certain sections of people, and that obviously appeals to the inner hatred that many people, to buried hatreds. Or buried feelings in people, so they try to bring those out. So we really need to get people to understand why it's important to have civil society, what are the contributions of civil society to national life, how civil society promotes equality, sustainable development, better, whether or cleaner water or good governance. We need to be able to make that argument much more. We need to, we really need to get the public's, because the public's rights are actually civil society rights. Constitutional freedoms and civil society rights, there's a very clear relation with them. And when civil society in a country flourishes, people in that country are going to have better governance and less corruption. So, but we also need to, as civil society organizations, we also need to work on our own accountability. We have to understand that, like judges, we will be held to a higher standard by societies. And so we need to work, we need to have impeccable accountability practices and communities of practice within civil society on values, so we can successfully challenge allegations of being controlled by, outside forces and so on. And importantly, we need to work beyond our silos. Oftentimes, even within the civil society discourse, firstly, civil society is a large concept. It's the arena outside the market, the family, and the state. And within that, there's NGOs, which are classic NGO, with non-governmental organizations. There are trade unions. There are think tanks. There are community-based organizations. And then of course within that, there's groups that work on democracy, groups that work on internet rights, the groups that work on LGBTI rights, groups that work on clean water, or or provision of basic social services. So we really need to understand and come together wherever we are, whether you're a human rights lawyer, or whether you're a student activist, spending your free time working on voter registration and so on, that this struggle really is a struggle for the progress that the humanity has made on human rights since 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. So we need to really come together. But more importantly, we need to avoid a narrative of disempowerment. Oftentimes, we talk about, yes, it's getting bad and there are many challenges. Yes, there are many challenges, but civil society is also continuing to win many decisive victories. Because of the power of international solidarity, we have had, freedom of information laws passed, activists have been released in some countries. In some countries have adopted, resolutions on human rights defenders. At the international level, we've been able to make some progress. And more importantly, people's mobilizations are continuing to happen. And and also, obviously this is a particular time when a number of, in Asia and Africa and Latin America and North America and Europe, where you find a number of right-wing populism has come together, and that's because we live in an interlinked world, and these changes happen. But we need to ready ourselves for the time when the outrageous and contrary and unsustainable promises that have been made by these right-wing leaders, people are going to be unraveled. People are going to start to understand that this glory or making countries great again when they were already quite great, those promises are going to unravel pretty soon. So we need to ready ourselves, and we need to be and we can't accept a narrative of disempowerment in these times.
Because all six of you have been so listening, we actually have quite a bit of time for discussion. So we're just going to open it up, and you can address your questions to any one of the panelists. And don't forget to Cesar and Chris, who are sitting over here. Or you can address your questions to the panel as a whole. The floor is open.
Hi, thank you for your comments. I wonder if all the panelists could comment a little bit more on the relationship between legitimacy and legality. This idea of dark times for civil society has a lot to do with the idea that there is a peeling away of legal protections for civil society organizations, or the diminishing of legal rights. But if we think about social movements, and particularly acts of civil disobedience, the power of acts of civil disobedience has less to do with the acts of protest and more to do with the spectacle of the consequences, say the punishment, say protester getting detained, beaten up by police, whatever. And so in that sense, the legitimacy of those kinds of disruptive actions has more of a basis, it has a basis in more than just morality, whether or not that is correlated with legality. It has more to do with an appeal to a sense of injustice. And so another way of phrasing this question would be, can we think about possibilities of a strong civil society that is not legally sanctioned? If we think about an important historical moment that rekindled academic interest in civil society, it was Solidarity in Poland, and that wasn't legal.
Maybe we can collect a few questions, and then we can have different panelists respond.
Okay, this is, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but for the leader of the organization in Hungary. You spoke about how legitimacy is key to combat government rhetoric, and I was wondering if you could talk about how your organization has strengthened its legitimacy. You mentioned the memes that you all have created and similar things like that, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more, please.
I'm going to quickly jump in then. I want to ask, we don't often talk about political parties and all of this, and I want to ask about political parties because civil society, like political parties, have this sort of key mediation role to play. They do it in very different ways. Parties are much more instrumental, and they're interested in securing power, and once they have power, they're interested in staying in power. But they also often have a very tense relationship with civil society. When I talk to politicians in India and South Africa about civil society or participation or movements, the first thing they always said is, who elected those guys anyways? And I'm sure you've heard this a million times. And it does raise this fundamental question of, why do you guys or any of us get to speak in the name of civil society? How are we authorized? What makes it representative? And to what extent has this wave or this clampdown, obviously the state is the key actor insofar as it can enforce laws that are repressive, et cetera. But again, so much of this is being done in South Africa. It's the African National Congress, and as you were emphasizing, a lot of the laws that are being used now by the BJP were used by the Congress, which was more than happy to silence civil society when it could as well. So, where do we situate political parties in this larger story? Maybe maybe you guys could field this round of questions and then we'll take another round. Or is there a hand up?
Oh, okay, so I will take the direct one. About the impact, if I got you right, of our efforts. So what I was getting at that I really believe that we need to find a narrative that tells the true story about human rights organizations, and that will contribute to, on the one hand, strengthening our legitimacy, but also protecting it, because, and it's not directly related, but I think that's a good signal that in every society, and that's true for Eastern Europe as well, from all the institutions like state institutions, businesses, civil society is still the most trusted sector by the people. So I think really the threat is that we will lose that legitimacy, not so much that we don't have it and we have to build it. And in terms of like the concrete numbers of this campaign, I can tell you that it can't be completely separated from the fact that this campaign went on in the early months of 2017, when there was anyway quite a lot of media attention on the organization. But that had us carry this alternative story. So our Facebook followership increased by almost 20% in 6 months. In the strongest month in April, our the post engagement and the post reach doubled as compared to the previous month. In 2017, our number of individual donors also doubled, and it's still not many, but it doubled. And in 1 year, the ratio of people who know what the HCLU is grew with 6%. So it's not only this campaign, but I think we did pretty well, and I'm extremely proud of my team. And one of the most uplifting moments of this campaign, and there were a series of demonstrations in the spring, was when we were standing with my colleagues in front of the parliament and just observing the demonstrations, and then out of a sudden a new chanting started, and it included the HCLU is needed term, and that's when we really realized that okay, this has a life of its own, and people picked it up, and it's really working.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to you, Patrick, on where do political parties lie in the spectrum of opinion on this, it really depends on whether they are in opposition or whether they are in power. And that's a simple answer, because if you look at it, today the same minister who, as the interior minister in India, passes legislations, says that he rues the fact that he did it. He finds it unacceptable that these laws are being used to suppress the opinion of civil society. And that's common across the world. If you take 1998, Erdogan is a prisoner of conscience of Amnesty International. Today, he feels empowered enough to lock up the chair and director of Amnesty for months together, and he says these are not comparable. If you take the BJP, some of the, during the emergency, when all of them were in prison and prisoners of conscience of Amnesty, you have blog posts written by their most powerful leaders like Advani saying how great they felt that they received these letters from Amnesty supporters. They come to power today and they charged Amnesty India with sedition. So, the government charged them in a state government, and they went after Amnesty. So it really depends on whether you're in power or in opposition. In India, I think one point when all political parties were united against civil society was in 2012 during the anti-corruption protests. And a lot of politicians who were friends, who members of parliament or ministers, I recall did come up to me and say that, look, it's going to take years now before any trust or credibility is going to be restored between political class and civil society, because you've broken the compact. Mass mobilization of this scale across the country on an issue like corruption, this is the end game for you. And I think a lot of a lot of what followed was along predictable lines. So I think it really depends on the perceived threat from civil society at any point in time, and whether you're in opposition or, I mean, the two instances in India, for instance, the mass mobilization that happened towards the end of the UPA regime, one was around the gang rape victim in Delhi, and the other was on anti-corruption. And finally, it was perceived that it was the anti-corruption agitation that led to the election of the Modi government in power. So I think, very simply put, it's located on where they are in terms of their politics. You want to take?
So I think the question that you asked was about civil disobedience. Were you saying to what extent is it okay to break the law?
No, she's saying that can we think about a story about civil society that is not legal, that legality versus legitimacy.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you need a structured thing in that sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, but for example, apartheid was legal, right? But it wasn't just. So we have to realize at some point when a law is just and when a law is and then take a considered decision. But the other thing I would say is that many of us in civil society also use peaceful means as a tactics, and sometimes people get very frustrated with certain tactics, and then they want to use maybe more aggressive tactics. So it's about a matter of tactics, but it's certainly I would say that your cause should, if you use peaceful means, you of course hold the moral high ground in that sense to be able to achieve your objective. The credibility question, I think you've probably addressed your question, but in case you can always ask us, follow-up question. But on the credibility question, that's interesting because the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are enshrined in almost all the constitutions of the world. They are part of customary international law. So nobody can go back and say that, like, why are you asking me that question? Because people who have power have been elected by the people, but they also are answerable to the people. And civil society in that sense may not, people may not have voted us, but as it's a part of constitutional democracy, and we would like to believe that every country should aspire to be a constitutional democracy, means that it's not just the voices or the opinions or the wishes of those who voted for the government of the day that should be part of national discourse plan. So we as civil society oftentimes represent alternative voices, people who are not counted in the political calculations of the government of the day. So that's our legitimacy in a sense, to make sure that everybody's voice is taken into account, that those voices, particularly of excluded populations, are represented in the political discourse.
So can I answer that question? I just wanted to respond to her also as well. Yeah, on the issue of legality and legitimacy, you're absolutely right. There are lots of actions, as we've seen in the last few years, which are done by civil society, which have increased their legitimacy without necessitating a legal structure or a legal organizational form. But on the other hand, there are lots of things that civil society does which requires a legal structure. It could, because there's civil society and civil society. There's civil society that runs schools, that runs hospitals, that does a lot of development work. There's the human rights organizations who mobilize people, but there's also human rights organizations who do human rights education in schools, or post bail bonds for prisoners, or do a lot of action which requires funding, requires resources of various kinds, and so on. So I don't think it's an either-or option. Yes, there are legitimacy certainly increases when you're more of a social movement and not necessarily in a legal form. But you can be as legitimate as in a legal, even if you're legally registered or as an organization that receives resources or distributes resources. So I don't think it's a either-or question in that sense.
So I know I had Ivor and Diana, and there were other hands.
All or none of you, just if I can be slightly provocative, because it's a debate which is current in South Africa, and I know it's in India as well, and elsewhere. Is what, if we take, I could ask the question in a variety of ways. Let me use the language of Chatterjee, a distinction between civil society and political society. And the question would be then, to what extent are you organs of civil society, in other words, organs of bourgeois society, which are seeking to enforce a system of human rights and a system of rules which in the end exclude and marginalize poor working people. And therefore, this is what we're confronting in South Africa. In order to be genuinely progressive, one needs to push organizations like yourselves out the way so that a genuinely progressive transformational government can, if you like, break the rules in order to realize real transformation. So if from that perspective, because that is a perspective which is very powerful in South Africa, to reconciling extreme nationalists with parts of the left in this politics, the sense that you or we are actually part of the problem. We're obstacles to genuine transformation.
Yeah, I'd like to continue that provocation. In the sense that something we haven't been talking about today is just how civil society is. I think we assume that civil society is good, and I don't mean that in an abstract, theoretical way. Sorry, Patrick, I'm not going to get into Habermas or anything like that, but I just mean very concretely that we associate it with good practices of voting in people who are your leaders, transparency in budgeting, participation in deliberation, and more or less equality among members. But what you see in the case that I know best is China, of course. And I hate to say this, but I think I'm not the only person who's noticed that there are instances of what you could call a type of authoritarian mimicry, where because people are born and raised and are educated in an authoritarian system that does not value those things, the very civil society that is given birth in that environment replicates those kinds of authoritarian practices. And so a very concrete example of that is when I was working with organizations in China, and I won't say what kind, but the leader of the organization would be called Big Boss. Big bosses can do everything. They can purge you if they want from your civil society organization. They do not have to release where funding comes from. They do not have to release where it goes. And so as a result of that, it's yes, they are advancing liberties and they are at the front lines of change, but at the same time the internal dynamics do not reflect the type of dynamics that we associate with civil society. And I always think back to the 1989 Tiananmen democracy movement, and to the outside world, yes, it was a moment of hope, and I certainly feel like that it was, but at the same time, if you watch this wonderful documentary called The Gate of Heavenly Peace, there's an interview with some of the activists saying, well, the people who got in control, the people who got in power, among the activists, were the ones who got in control of the microphone. And the people who got in control of the microphone were people who were the first ones to rush to the train station to recruit new followers by calling themselves leaders, even though they were not leaders at all. And then they would rush to Tiananmen Square and get in control of the means of communication, and that would be the way they established activism. And so I guess this is a broader question to those of us who work in civil society in different contexts, is how are these phenomenons prevalent in other settings, and how do we tackle that?
Yeah, my question also sort of follows through that, which is, it's a question that sort of might apply to a more exceptional context, which is refugees, where the same perhaps civil liberties and all don't even apply, legally speaking. I heard at some point, I've forgotten whose presentation, that because NGOs are often, one of the ways in which NGOs are smeared, or civil society organizations are smeared, is by considering them foreign agents. And I was wondering if it's possible for NGOs to be doing important work to protect civil liberties, but at the same time be foreign agents. It could be both at the same time. And the example I have in my head is, for instance, human rights organizations working in Jordan and Lebanon with Syrian refugees, where on the one hand you have organizations doing extremely important work trying to protest against the Lebanese and the Jordanian, but especially the Lebanese government's routine rounding up of refugees, torture, mistreatment. But at the same time, in being funded by European governments, one of the reasons why European governments have been pumping so much money into civil society organizations in Lebanon and Jordan is precisely to keep the refugees there, right? Those same debates don't seem to transform or translate when it comes to refugees in Europe, and one has seen what is happening to refugee policy in Europe. And in fact, it's not something that they're unaware of, because in so many of the interviews I do with civil society actors, one of the dilemmas they express is, on the one hand, having to lecture government employees about how to better respect the human rights of refugees, knowing fully well that their own governments are not doing that. And so, how does that, and so at one level, without wanting to, I've almost had to sort of sympathize with the government line, even though it's a horrific line to take, that we don't want the refugees here, we want to kick them out, because of the fact that civil society organizations have sort of played that game rather selectively as to who has to fulfill these rights and who doesn't. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with who's funding the civil society organizations. So I was wondering, how do you negotiate that sort of dilemma in terms of the responsibilities to funders and the responsibilities to human rights?
Okay, one more question.
Yeah. I'm sorry I came late, so I hope I didn't miss something. So, and I have a question or a comment, if you wish, really for Mandeep, Tiwana's discussion of that there's this second half of the 20th century, which is kind of a golden age of civil society, and we've fallen from that. And I think, as someone who's old enough to have been working in an NGO in Washington back in 1979, 1981, the beginning of the Reagan period, I can tell you that the perception really was not at all that it was easy or that it was a golden age. And I think in retrospect, you can look back and see that. But when you look at detailed histories of civil society movements, historically, deeply historically to the present time, many of them suffer from some of the same kinds of attacks that people are suffering from today. And I don't say that to minimize at all, but I think we can learn by realizing in the past it wasn't perceived at the time as a golden age. It was perceived as exactly this kind of struggle that people today continue to go through.
Okay.
Okay. Who wants to go?
Okay, so I will be provocative as well. I think the reason why there is such a effective clampdown on civil society is because we haven't done everything too well, and because we made mistakes, and because there are a lot of issues to tackle within the human rights movement. And I'm focusing on the human rights movement because I know that the most, but probably a lot of that can be extrapolated to the civil society organizations in general. So I think we were already engaging in a more inward-looking critical discussion about our role in society when this whole phenomenon was identified. Maybe it's not started, because it's really hard to say when it was started, but when it was identified. So I think there are a lot of criticisms that are justified and very legitimate towards civil society organizations. Just to name one, the transparency issue, I think that's very important. And also, you see so many practices that are, to say that is controversial in a society, replicated within organizations. Me, as a woman heading a civil society organization, I can tell you a lot of stories about how misogyny and me being a woman was a difficult issue among civil society organizations. So I don't think that we are, kind of detached from the real world and all being angels working for the right causes and whatever. So, and I think that's a very useful process when we do realize our own biases, and when we do realize that, for example, at an organization like, let's say, the ACLU, we are working on Roma rights, but actually the people who are working on Roma rights, none of them are Roma. And then you start changing that. So I do think that there are a lot of there's a lot of value in self-reflection. And that also, I think, speaks to the question of your question, because in a sense, civil society organizations, like any other organizations, can contribute to maintaining the system, while human rights, I have this very strong belief, is about questioning the system and questioning the establishment to make sure that it works better for more people. And I will end with a saying by Maina Kiai, who I think many of you know, who is a former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of association and assembly, and he always says that the problem is that human rights organizations started to become a project, and they used to be a struggle. So we have to go back to the struggle and abandon the project phase. And I think that's kind of a response to your question as well.
Okay. Can I? Yeah, please. So, the question, are we standing in the way of the revolution, comrade? I mean, look, one would accept the criticism that a lot of the human rights organizations have esoterized the regime of rulemaking to a point where it does not resonate with common people, which is also the argument that's made about liberals in many of these recent elections that you've had where populist regimes have been elected to power. But I don't think you can extrapolate that to say that therefore it's a binary position, that you can either have a social transformation led by social movements where NGOs have no part, or that in some way they do not want that genuine transformation to take place because it would challenge their position in the hierarchy in civil society. So I'm cognizant of that criticism of international NGOs. But I think, again, it's not a binary, because in a large number of cases, in India, for instance, social movements work hand in hand with established civil society organizations, NGOs in particular. A lot of the research, for instance, for social movements comes from academia, comes from NGOs, which are funded, resourced, have the ability to deliver it on a range of issues, whether it's on employment, on the right to information, and so on and so forth. Second, the organized civil society, or the NGO sector, in what you mean, has assisted in mobilizing for even social movements in many cases, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world. So I don't really see it as a binary in that sense. I'm not sure whether the kind of political transformation that one is aspiring for can really happen within the existing, because it's about economics, it's about a whole lot of things that are way beyond the control of or beyond the pay grade of international NGOs in the context of local politics and political economy. So I don't see them playing that huge a role even in the coming years.
So yeah, I think when we look at civil society as a concept, it's large. It's the arena outside the family, the market, and the state. So it's so huge, and I think none of us can afford claim to speak for civil society, because civil society is necessarily huge. And just like rest of society, civil society reflects the society it comes from. But I would still say that civil society organizations that work on human rights and social justice issues, bring a certain amount of commitment. People do work with relatively lesser salaries. They're usually quite overworked. If you see, they do a lot of, they are driven by the motive of trying to, do social good. So in that sense, I would say there is a certain, a certain advantage from civil society organizations that comes. But that said, I mean, there are civil society organizations, democratic governments also have government-organized NGOs. These government-organized NGOs are not only from non-democratic countries. In fact, a number of Western governments also have government-organized NGOs, or they are organizations, that don't always follow the values and so on, and there are many issues on that sense. I think what I was trying to say about the 20th century, because I only started my career in 2002, so I wouldn't want to call something a golden age that I wasn't, that I obviously don't know much about. What I was trying to say is that the human rights discourse made advances, whether it was the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, or whether it was the Civil and Political Rights Convention, or even if the Durban Conference on Racism, or whether it was the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. In the 20th century, those advances happened. But as soon as we got into the 21st century, the war on terror really reversed the right to a fair trial, like torture. Torture was, government shamefacedly did it. But here you had a government that actually wanted to legislate torture. That's when the slippery slope, I think, started to happen. And obviously now we're in a stage where a legal argument has been made on drone strikes. I mean, without declaring a war on the whole world. I mean, a war on terror, and then you just go and go beyond state sovereignty and so on. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that the respect for international norms. It's not that it may even be better today than the 21st century, but we made advances, and we don't seem to be making substantial advances like we made in subsequent decades of the 21st century. It seems we are starting to regress.
What if I just said, for example, so many advances in LGBTI rights have had. The first country that legalized same-sex marriage was 2000, and then others, 24 countries that have done it. What about rights of people with disabilities? That's a 21st century issue mainly. So it's not that no advances have been made.
No, certainly not. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the pace of advances has somewhat gotten reduced. The respect for, there's been major obstructions that have started to happen under the discourse. The security discourse has become a really important part. I mean, this has been repurposed, there are genuine concerns from terrorism, but these genuine concerns have been repurposed by people who don't believe in the value of human rights, or people who are genuinely misinformed, or people who just, they actually believe, maybe some of them actually believe what they're doing right things. But it's not been an advancement, it's like it's been a reversement, but certainly not to discount the
just to add to that, I mean, it's indisputable, I think, over the last 2-3 years in particular, that you are seeing a reversal in the legitimacy of the human rights regime globally. If you just look at the statement of European leaders and the United States of America, and if you look at the legitimization of torture, it was inconceivable 4 years ago that a leader of the UK would speak about it, or the leader of the US would speak about it, or the kinds of misogyny that's entered mainstream global politics. I think there is a genuine reversal. The respect for the human rights regime globally, the ability of countries to say at the UN that, look, the Human Rights Council needs to sort itself out, otherwise we are not going to be part of it. I think there is a sense that that we are at the cusp of a profound change in which the established order on human rights is really seeing a reversal. I mean, I don't know where it will lead us to, but if you just look at the public statements made by global leaders over the last 2.5 years, it would be deeply worrying, whether it's walking out of the European Court of Human Rights with the UK, or, as I said, or as Mandeep spoke about, legitimization of torture and so on. There is a crisis that one sees on the entire human rights regime, which I think is indisputable, which is of a very recent nature.
Okay, so we have time for one more round of questions, and I have Khaled and Jonas and Arch and Peter. And anyone else?
Very quickly, because I agree with some of the premise of the provocative questions, but I thought it was unfair to address it to most of the people in the panel. I mean, with the partial exception of Mandeep. I mean, those are guys who work unpartial only, because those are guys who work on advocacy. And civil society, as Mandeep said, is a huge animal. But since I did wear the two hats, working on service provision as well as on advocacy and human rights, you cannot address that question on refugees, my friend in the middle here, because at the end of the day, there's a huge element of instrumentalization that happened to both foreign and local NGOs that work in service provision, as well as actually to the United Nations, the intergovernmental organization, that have been instrumentalized, politicized, and there's a long history of that. But the solution is not definitely to side with the government, like the government of Lebanon, whose powers are party to the problem in Syria, as a matter of fact, causing the million refugees that went out from Syria, and that will not help anybody anyway, at the end of the day. But service provision organizations are in a much more different position, because even the the background or the roots of advocacy and human rights guys in IHRL, they are similar to IHL, but they are actually different. I mean, when you work for the ICRC and you went to the Auschwitz, those guys hid what they've seen in Auschwitz for decades. And they thought they were actually fine with their own conviction because they had access in exchange for silence. And ICRC did that in Abu Ghraib until one of them actually leaked the information as well. So it's really different dynamics, and you can't put them in the same basket. As to Diane about corruption and incompetence and maybe supporting or stopping transformation as when I look at organizations in North Africa, for example, that are being harassed or brought to trial or interrogated, they are usually like maybe 6 to 10 in each of them, out of maybe 40,000 registered organizations or 26,000. And you look at them, they are not gongos. They are usually not service providers, unless they are part of a golden network or part of a Muslim Brother network. They are usually advocacy organizations working on policies that the government or the elite don't want to change. And that gives you a sense of actually how to differentiate between serious, independent, progressive civil society organizations and civil society organizations that actually would like and benefit from the status quo and would like it to continue.
Jonas?
Yeah, thanks. I guess the question, the discussion whether there's this overall retreat in terms of human rights or whether there's perhaps some more specific progress is also related to the fact that like there's not this kind of clear-cut, coherent set of human rights, and they all together either progress or so my question was for you as activists and organizations that base, as you said, in your legitimacy to an important extent on this reference to human rights. How you deal with this notion of struggle, not only a sense of struggle for human rights, but because of this nature of human rights is not the kind of coherent, clear-cut set, is also always a struggle over human rights. And so even if you have every organization can point to a specific human rights that is established here and there, you're engaging in these kind of struggles and politics in the sense that you have to decide which one you're promoting in a particular way, because there are of course many human rights and they lend themselves to different interpretations and prioritization. So you yourself engage in these kind of politics and you decide, you prioritize, you interpret. And so how do you deal with this issue if the whole legitimacy kind of discourse is so important in the sense of that there are these established human rights? Thanks.
Harsh?
So I said that I want to say that a crisis, and there definitely is a crisis. A crisis is also an opportunity. It can become an opportunity, and I think this is a moment when we need to do a lot of reflection. Some of this has been said, but still, what is the practice of our values? What is our practice of solidarity, of truth, of equality, and of justice that we stand for? How do we practice it in our work, in our daily lives? Gandhi keep reminding us the importance of consistency of means and ends. So are we using means that are compatible with the end that we are wanting to achieve? You spoke about civil disobedience, and I think that the important thing about civil disobedience was a principle that you needed to fight injustice by causing suffering only to yourself and using your own suffering to bring about change. I think that's something that we have lost along the way. So I think that we need to, this is an opportunity to reflect, to make human rights work less detached, less techno-managerial, more engaged, and more founded in our fundamental principles, and to introspect and to change even the language, the discourse. I think that is one. But the other opportunity I do think is to look at the economic model. And I do think there's a crisis, a global crisis of neoliberal capitalism, and I think a lot of what we've seen is the outcome of that. There are many aspects to it, but in my own country, jobless growth is so spectacular that we're adding 1 million people to the workforce every single month, 1 million people. Plus there are about 8 million people also who live in agriculture every year, which means about 20 million people. The number of jobs officially created was about 200,000 in the last year. And this is net figures. Actually, a lot of jobs are getting destroyed in the formal sector, and it's you're getting the lowest end. So I think that it's an opportunity first, on one hand, to introspect on our practices, people who believe in a more just society and a more compassionate society in terms of how we live our lives and work. But it's also an opportunity to look at the context in which the promises that were made 25 years ago with neoliberalism, that they have failed so spectacularly, and maybe we need to address those. So I think just looking at those opportunities at this moment of crisis.
Yeah, no. Any other questions? Yes, please.
My question is for Ms. Yesil. You just kind of shuddered in a sense when you talked about this idea of a Facebook revolution and a Twitter revolution. So I was wondering if you could kind of hammer out why your opinions about that, and if so, if those aren't the right outlets for people to kind of protest or express their opinions, especially for the youth, what other outlets do you see as a better alternative?
Terrific. So we have just a few more minutes left, so leave it to the panel to respond. So.
Yeah.
Please, please.
Yeah, I'm not really a big fan of Facebook or Twitter revolutions. First, I think it's these terms overemphasize the technology at the expense of human agency, and when like thousands of people were gathering in Tahrir Square, it obviously didn't happen overnight because people were sharing messages via Facebook. Yes, they were sharing messages via Facebook, but also by text messaging and whatnot, and spreading those messages. But even before Tahrir Square, there was this long history of Egyptian activism going back to at least, not an expert, but as far as I know, going back at least 6 to 8 years. So there was all this, if not underground, but kind of this below the ground activism and organization that human rights activists and other civil society actors in Egypt were actively engaged in. So it was, and every time Western media or Western analysts, political or media analysts, name these revolutions Facebook or Twitter, it is as if thanks to these Western technologies and Western corporations and companies, all these Eastern societies or non-Western societies can rise up or lead to some social, political, and or economic change. So that's my issue with it. I'm not necessarily suggesting that these technologies do not play any role at all. They certainly do. I mean, they help people mobilize, organize, share information, and also in the case of Turkey during Gezi Park protests, they helped share news and information about police brutality, which wasn't covered in the media at all. So for bringing those questions and issues to the fore, they do play a part. But people organize nonetheless, even if it's without Twitter or Facebook. So.
Okay. So I think there was a question about human rights and different notions of human rights. I would say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, provides a fair enough framework in its 20 articles about the world. Of course, the issue of sexual orientation is not there, but the right against discrimination is there. So, you can, in a sense, the framework is broad enough. It has economic and social rights, it has civil and political freedoms, it even talks about internationalism, so, and I'm very proud that actually there's an Indian woman called Hansa Mehta. In fact, if you look at the first section of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was supposed to say all men are created equal. It actually says all human beings are created equal, which was Hansa Mehta's insistence she drew on a social activism when she was part of the debates that happened. And an interesting anecdote is, and then again, there's the challenge of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is South Africa's representative was generally Jan Smuts, who really didn't believe in the human rights of his fellow South Africans. But the point is that I think the debate about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been settled in a sense. So it does provide us some amount of framework. And I would certainly say, Harsh, I think you raised a good point about being hopeful. And I also feel that this is going to lead to a pendulum shift. We are in a particular moment in history. People are already feeling the neoliberal economic policies, market fundamentalism. There's already huge amounts of inequality. There are people who have really benefited a lot, and there are huge amounts of losers. The monetized access to public services is actually sending more and more people into poverty. It's very easy to slip from the lower middle class into poverty. And that's a challenge because the social contract between the citizen and the state has frayed because we pay taxes to the state. But our state wants to take the taxes from us and then give a contract to somebody else to provide policing to us, to provide water to us, provide electricity to us. And then we have to pay to that company and we have to pay taxes to the state. So it's double whammy in a sense. And plus we don't get the information that we want from those companies because this company doesn't feel obligated. And I know that it's very difficult for in a U.S. context to talk about it because the U.S. organized itself very differently. But the rest of the world, it's very natural for us to get electricity. I grew up in socialist India, and we had an electricity company that ran in loss, and it was fine that it ran at loss because that's why we paid taxes. Everybody pays direct and indirect taxes, and you expect something in return. You don't expect the state to give that to somebody else and use that as an avenue for profit making. So there is going to be a blowback from that, and I think, and there's going to be a blowback from right-wing policies, and and we just have to ready ourselves for that moment. And it's actually it's quite strange because we live in an age when we have so much more social, cultural, economic relations. Yet these politicians have tried to ghettoize us. There's people are marrying across across regions. People are moving. The history of human civilization is the history of migration. So I don't know how anybody can even make these national constructs are 200 years old. These boundaries, these borders are so amorphous. They never even existed 50 years ago. If the world map was different 100 years ago, it was totally different. If you look at 150 years ago, it was totally different. So there is going to be some amount of change. And perhaps maybe young people are going to lead that change because they have, their values are certainly much more, open. They're much more than others. And I think for us in civil society, the big challenge that most of us, people like me who work, is that sometimes we get over-professionalized. Our rigorous adherence to the plan comes in the way of sometimes makes us forget why we're here in the first place. We're here to promote social justice and human rights, but sometimes we spend sometimes doing the wrong things, and answering emails when we should actually be speaking to our constituents and so on. So and also there is the legitimacy. I think the issue of legitimacy. Whose legitimacy do we believe in? We need to have legitimacy in the values. We need to have legitimacy towards those. Our first primary responsibility is towards those we purport to serve. But unfortunately, sometimes we become more accountable to whether it's donors or whether it's the public at large, towards donors or towards our boards or towards our fellow peers. But we should actually be first and foremost accountable to those we say we serve. And the issue of, I know the issue of foreign agents came up, and I'll end here, is the foreign agents issue is such a bogey. Because all those governments, that talk about foreign agents, have no problem doing military exercises or accepting aid. That doesn't make their governments foreign agents. The Ethiopian government itself actually was actually the trendsetter in this to the Charities and Societies Proclamation, when the foreign agents law gets huge amounts of foreign assistance, but it doesn't call itself a foreign government. But if you're a civil society organization, you get more than 10% funding, you become a foreign agent. Your military can do exercises with the foreign government, but it doesn't get influenced. You can go to the World Economic Forum and come and tell foreign governments to come and invest in your country, but at the same time, you are attacking those civil society organizations that gets piddly amounts of money. So there's so much hypocrisy in this foreign agents thing. We really need to unravel that much more.
Just to respond to Jonas's question I think the human rights industry does have a lot to answer for in the way certain rights are privileged over others, particularly in the last few years. I mean, that's indisputable, and that is linked to the way global societies have functioned. So, for a decade, workers' rights were not fashionable, not on, but LGBTQI rights were on. There was money available for it. Donors were willing to pump in funds where they were not for workers' rights. For years, we've seen how civil political rights were accorded far more importance, even though all rights were indivisible, over economic, cultural, social rights. And many observers have noted that it was this inability to take on economic, political, economic, cultural, and social rights, which led to the alienation of people in the global south from the human rights movement or the human rights industry. So I tend to agree with you that yes, we have a lot to answer for in terms of at different points in time privileging some rights over the others. I mean, it calls for reflection for sure.
I'll just jump into on that question of struggle over rights. It's a difficult struggle, but sometimes it can be made easy for you. I remember my very first job. I was hired to coordinate the program on extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. That was the hot issue. All the funding in the Philippines was there, and we got, I forget how much EU funding. And it was a 3-year project, but when you're trying to build a grassroots quick reaction mechanism in some of the most remote places in the Philippines, 3 years is not enough. So by the end of the 3rd year, we were coming up with new proposals to different funders, but at that time, it stopped being a hot issue. Suddenly, it was trafficking, human trafficking, and USAID just put out a call. So I was talking to my boss, and I said, so what do we do? Well, can you write a new proposal on human trafficking? And this was a very good organization, but had to reckon with choices or needs for survival. And then, so it was my first job straight out of law school, and I was like, okay, so I guess human trafficking or the rights associated to it are more important now than the rights associated in situations of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. And then years later, that's why I got so preoccupied with this issue of funding. And you're not dictated by donors. You make the decision, but you have to reckon with reality. So later on, I did this research where I spoke with more than 100 activists in different countries, and I found out that the lower the level you go, meaning the more grassroots you are, the smaller you are, the more vulnerable you are to these choices. So I remember when Cesar hired me more than 3 years ago, my first day at work, I asked him, so what's my budget, what are my deliverables, what issues are funded, etc. And then he told me, just decide on what issues are most important within the field you work on. I was like, are you kidding? But Dejusticia is very privileged in that sense that we're given mostly core funding to work on what we believe are important. But most organizations, NGOs in the world aren't in that position.
Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to thank all of you for